116th Street, Harlem. September 12, 1968, 12 minutes past noon. The sun is sitting dead overhead, no cloud anywhere, and the heat that has been building since July has nowhere left to go. It just presses down on the street like a fist, slow and permanent, turning the tar soft at the edges of the sidewalk and making the air above the parked cars shimmer like something alive. On the block between Lenox and 7th, the afternoon is doing what Harlem afternoons always do. An old woman in a floral house dress is moving slow past a bodega, 2 paper bags hanging from each hand, her eyes down. Her pace the pace of someone who has been walking this block for 40 years and has no intention of looking up. 3 kids are running a stickball game against the brick face of an apartment building, one of them narrating his own at-bats in a voice too loud for the size of the audience. A mailman is halfway through his route, his shirt dark at the back, his bag heavy, his face completely blank. A street vendor has his table set up near the corner. Incense, bootleg cassettes, a hand-lettered sign offering something at a price that is already a deal. 40, maybe 50 people visible from any single point on the sidewalk. And up at the far end of the block, sitting inside Sylvia's cafe at a window table with his 3 brothers, in a plate of fried chicken and the particular good mood that comes from watching your business print money, is Frank Lucas. He is 33 years old. He is 5'11" and 170 pounds. He does not look like the most dangerous man in New York City. He never did. That was always the point. He is watching the window, and when he sees what is coming down 116th Street, he puts down his chicken, wipes both hands clean on a paper napkin. His brother Huey looks up from across the table. "Frank, where are you going?" Frank does not answer. He pushes back his chair, stands up, straightens his jacket, and walks out the door. He crosses the street. What happens next in the next 4 minutes is going to change Harlem forever. But to understand why, to understand the real weight of what Frank Lucas does on that sidewalk, and why 300 people watch it happen, and not one of them says a word to the police, you have to go back 6 weeks. You have to go back to a funeral. Because this story does not begin with a gun. It begins with a drink set on a piano without a coaster, and 3 seconds of silence that cost a man everything he had. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, died on July 7, 1968, at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue in Harlem. He was sitting at a table. He was mid-sentence. The heart attack took him fast, and before anyone could do much of anything, he was gone. He was 62 years old, and he had spent most of those years as the undisputed power broker of Harlem's underworld, the man who brokered arrangements between the black street organizations and the Italian families uptown, the man who kept things operating at a level of controlled violence rather than chaos, the man who understood, better than almost anyone, that real power is not about how loud you are. It is about what happens when you go quiet. Bumpy Johnson had been to prison 3 times. He had survived assassinations, betrayals, wars with the mob, investigations by every law enforcement body in New York. He had come out of all of it with his reputation, not just intact but enhanced. And when he died, he left behind something that every major player in New York's underworld immediately understood to be the most valuable and most dangerous thing on the market: a vacuum. Frank Lucas had been by Bumpy's side for years. He was not just the driver, though that was the word people used. Driver, errand boy, the help. He was something more than that, and the people who actually paid attention knew it. Bumpy had been teaching Frank, not formally, not with lessons or instructions, but the way real education works in that world, by proximity, by example, by letting a man watch how the game is actually played at the highest level and trusting him to understand what he sees. Frank had been watching for years. He had been learning things that cannot be learned any other way. And when Bumpy died, Frank Lucas went to the funeral and stood in the back and paid his respects and kept his face completely still. Because what Frank felt in that room was not just grief. It was recognition. The game had just reset. The board was open. And Frank Lucas was the only person in that room who had been inside Bumpy Johnson's head long enough to know exactly how you play it. He was also, as far as most of the room was concerned, the driver, the errand boy, the help. A man named Tango was also at that funeral. Tango. Nobody in Harlem ever used his real name, and we are not going to start now, was a significant figure in the Harlem narcotics trade. 6'4", 270 pounds of muscle that had been in the game since the early 1960s. He had Italian connections, which in 1968 Harlem was the equivalent of having access to a supply chain that nobody else could touch. He had a reputation that cleared sidewalks. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and expected it to reorganize itself around him, and for most of his career, it had. Tango looked at Frank Lucas at Bumpy Johnson's funeral and saw what he wanted to see: a man without a boss, a driver without a car to drive, an errand boy whose principal was in a coffin. And Tango made a decision, right there in that room full of grief and politics and barely concealed ambition, to establish the new order as quickly and publicly as possible. He picked up his drink and set it on the piano. No coaster. Frank was nearby. He saw it. He walked over, picked up the drink, wiped the ring off the piano surface, set the glass back down properly. Small thing. The kind of thing a man does out of respect for a space and the person the space is honoring. Tango waited until Frank was turning away and then called out across the room, loud enough to be heard at every table, in a voice designed to carry and to land. Yo, Frank, while you're at it, get me a light too. The room shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically. Nobody knocked over a chair or stopped mid-sentence. But the shift happened. Everyone who was anyone in that room understood exactly what had just been said and exactly what it meant. Bumpy Johnson was barely cold, and Tango was running his test. Was Frank Lucas going to step into the vacuum Bumpy left, or was he going to stay where people like Tango needed him to stay? Small, useful, invisible, obedient? Frank Lucas turned and looked at Tango. He did not say a word. He held that look for exactly 3 seconds. Then he walked away. 3 seconds. That was all. But everyone in that room, everyone who understood how this world worked, felt those 3 seconds like weather. They knew something was coming. They just did not know that Frank Lucas had already decided exactly what it was going to be, and that he had already started counting down. 3 weeks after the funeral, Frank Lucas came back from Thailand. What he brought back with him would eventually be known on every street corner in New York, in every borough, in every neighborhood where the trade operated, by a name that became a kind of legend: Blue Magic, 98% pure heroin. In a market where most product was cut to 30 or 40% purity, cut with quinine, cut with lactose, cut with whatever the supplier had on hand, Blue Magic was operating in a different category entirely. It was not just better product. It was product that made everything else on the market feel like a counterfeit version of itself. Dealers who got their hands on a sample and used it understood immediately that they were looking at a monopoly. Customers who bought it once came back for it specifically and would not accept substitutes. Frank's distribution network was not yet what it would become, but Blue Magic was building it faster than anything else could have. 50,000 a week coming in, then 75, then 100. And climbing. Frank needed infrastructure. He needed men in the right places who could move serious volume without drawing the wrong kind of attention. He needed, in the language of the business, lieutenants. He looked at the existing landscape of Harlem's trade, and he made a calculated decision. He would offer territory to established operators who already had the connections and the street credibility to move product at scale. One of those operators was Tango. The arrangement Frank offered was not complicated, and it was not optional. Tango would receive exclusive rights to distribute Blue Magic in a defined territory. In exchange, Frank would receive 20% of gross revenue on everything moved. Not a partnership, not a negotiation, not a discussion. This is how it works. Take it or build your own supply chain of 98% pure product from Southeast Asia, which you cannot do because I am the only person in New York who has that relationship and that logistic structure. Take it. Tango took it. He moved the product. Blue Magic sold itself, which meant that Tango's operation was suddenly generating more revenue than it ever had before. Frank's collectors came around on schedule to collect the 20%. And Tango laughed at them, sent them back with a message that was designed, like everything Tango did, to be heard beyond the room. It was said in, "Tell that driver boy if he wants his money, he can come get it himself." Frank heard the message. He did not react. He did not send word back. He did not make threats. He did not escalate. He did something that most men in his position would not have had the discipline to do, something that Bumpy Johnson had spent years teaching him was the difference between power and the performance of power. Frank Lucas went to work. Every morning for 3 weeks, Frank drove Nelly Bell, his Lincoln, the car he had been using as his office and his observation post and his mobile command center for years, to a spot across from Tango's corner at 116th Street. He came in disguise. Janitor's uniform one day, mailman's uniform the next. Sometimes just a bum, dirty coat, collar up, bottle in a bag, sitting on a stoop with nowhere to be. He watched. He counted. He documented. Tango came to that corner every day at noon. Same time, same route, same bodega stop for a Coke and a ham sandwich. Same 3 men with him. Same swagger. Same absolute certainty that the world had been organized for his benefit and would continue to operate that way indefinitely. Predictable. And Frank Lucas knew, had known since. Bumpy Johnson first sat him down and explained how the game actually worked. Not the street version, not the version people told themselves, but the real version that predictable men do not last. Predictability is a death sentence in slow motion. Tango had been writing his own sentence for 3 weeks, and he had no idea. September 12th, Thursday. Frank's brothers had come up from North Carolina. Richie, Huey, Turner, and the table at Sylvia's was loud with the happiness of family and money and momentum, all arriving at once. Blue Magic was everywhere. The operation was generating revenue that none of them had seriously imagined possible even 6 months ago. Frank was eating fried chicken at a window table and watching the street the way he always watched everything, quietly, thoroughly, without looking like he was watching anything at all. And then Tango appeared at the far end of the block, walking down 116th with that signature swagger. 3 men behind him, not a concern visible anywhere on his body. His face carrying the expression of a man who believes the universe has made a series of correct decisions in his favor. Frank put the chicken down, wiped his hands on the napkin, stood up. Huey looked across the table. "Frank, where are you going?" No answer. Frank crossed the street. When Tango saw Frank coming toward him, the smile appeared immediately. Wide, easy, rehearsed. The smile that said, "I have been waiting for this. I have been practicing this. I know exactly how this goes." His crew read it and slowed. They fanned out into a loose semicircle behind him, casual in the way that only men who are ready for something can be casual. There were 40 people on this particular stretch of sidewalk. Old women with grocery bags. Kids with their stickball game. The mailman working his route. The vendor with his incense and his cassettes. 300 people within sight of this corner if you counted every angle. A normal Thursday afternoon in Harlem, full of normal Thursday people going about their normal Thursday lives. None of them knew they were about to become witnesses to the moment that changed everything. Tango let Frank get close, let him walk all the way across the street and stop 6 feet away before he opened his mouth. When he spoke, it was at a volume designed to fill the sidewalk, designed to reach every one of those 40 people immediately surrounding them and carry to the ones beyond. Performance. Everything Tango did was performance. Well, 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 Tango said. If it ain't Bumpy's little driver boy. What you want, Frank? You here to shine my shoes? The crew laughed. Not because it was funny, or not only because it was funny, but because laughing was their job in this moment. Backing their man. Signaling alignment. The rehearsed laugh, the one that says whatever happens next, we are on his side. We already know how this ends. Frank stopped. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet. Not aggressive, not heated, almost friendly, the tone of a man having a business conversation at a reasonable volume. You owe me money, Tango. 20% of everything you move this month. That comes to about 18 grand. Tango let the smile get wider. Let it push up into something that was almost amusement, almost pity, almost contempt, and mixture of all three that he had spent years perfecting. 18 grand? Man, I don't owe you nothing. You ain't Bumpy. You ain't nobody. You just the help. And the help don't get a percentage. The sidewalk went still. Not silent, not completely. There was still the city noise underneath everything. The distant traffic, the ambient hum, but the 40 people in immediate range had all, without any visible coordination, stopped moving, stopped their conversations, oriented toward this moment the way iron filings orient toward a magnet. They could feel what was in the air. They had felt it before, on other corners, other days. They knew what it smelled like. I'm going to give you one chance, Frank said. Reach into that jacket and pull out my money. Tango spread his arms wide. He was playing to the room now, or playing to the street, which was the only room that mattered. Or what, Frank? What you gonna do? We in broad daylight, baby. 300 people watching. Cops rolling by any minute. So what exactly you gonna do? What Frank Lucas did was reach into his waistband and pull out a .45 caliber pistol. The chrome caught the afternoon light. Everything happened at once. A woman 2 storefronts away gasped, a single sharp sound. The kids dropped their stickball and froze. The vendor's hand released the cassette he was holding, and it hit the sidewalk with a plastic clatter. Frank raised the gun and leveled it directly at Tango, not at his chest. At his face. At the center of his forehead, dead between his eyes. The smile left Tango's face like someone had unplugged it. His crew's hands moved. Instinct, training, the muscle memory of men who have been in bad situations before. And Frank's voice came out flat and quiet and completely certain. Any of you move, Tango dies first. Then you make a choice. The crew stopped. They had heard the kind of voice that Frank was using, and they understood it the way animals understand weather, not intellectually, but in the body, in the place below thought where real decisions get made. This was not a bluff. Tango understood it too. But Tango had spent his entire career as the largest, loudest, most physically imposing man in every room he walked into, and that career had built a set of reflexes that were not easy to override. He tried to get the smile back, tried to find the performance again. Man, you ain't gonna do nothing. You ain't crazy. You shoot me here, you go to prison for life. Every cop in Harlem gonna be on you before your feet hit the pavement. You ain't that stupid, Frank. Frank's finger moved to the trigger. You know what Bumpy taught me, Tango? His voice had not changed. Still quiet. Still almost conversational. He taught me that respect isn't about being liked. It's about being understood. Right now, you need to understand something. Understand what? And Tango's voice, for the first time in this conversation, for possibly the first time in years, had something in it that was not performance. A crack, small but real, like a sound from inside a wall. That I'm not Bumpy's driver anymore. A pause that lasted exactly long enough. I'm the king, and kings don't negotiate. Wait, Frank, wait. Hold on. Frank pulled the trigger. A shot cracked the air open. Then 3 more followed, each one separate, each one deliberate, each one placed. Bam, bam, 4 shots total. The sound rolled down 116th Street and bounced off the brick faces of the buildings and came back, changed, flatter, harder, final. Tango's body, all 270 pounds of it, all 6 feet 4 inches of it, all the weight of a career built on intimidation and physical presence and the belief that size equals safety, crumpled. Hit the concrete the way heavy things hit concrete, without grace, without softness, with the full collaboration of gravity. Blood spread from beneath him across the pavement, dark and immediate, mixing with the grime of the sidewalk and the August heat radiating up from the concrete. The street went silent in a way that was different from the silence before. Before, the silence had been the silence of anticipation. This was the silence of aftermath. Not one person on that sidewalk moved. Not one person screamed. Not the women with their bags. Not the kids who had been playing stickball 30 seconds ago. Not the mailman. Not the vendor. 300 people within sight of this corner, and the silence was absolute. Frank Lucas stood over Tango's body. He was not breathing hard. His hands were steady. He bent down with the unhurried movement of a man doing something routine, reached into Tango's jacket, and found a thick roll of bills. $23,000 in cash. Frank counted it, standing over the body. Standing in plain sight of 300 witnesses in broad daylight on 116th Street in Harlem. He counted out 20,000, folded it, and put it into his jacket pocket. He took the remaining 3,000 and released the bills over Tango's chest, let them fall and settle across the blood-stained shirt like something ceremonial. That's for your funeral. He straightened up, turned around, walked back across the street, walked into Sylvia's cafe, sat down at his table, picked up his fried chicken, took a bite. His brothers were looking at him from across the table with the expressions of men who have just witnessed something their minds have not finished processing. The cafe owner, Miss Dorothy, was standing at the door to the kitchen with her hand pressed flat against her mouth, her eyes wide above it. Frank looked at her. His voice was the same voice he used to order coffee. Everything's fine, Miss Dorothy. Everything's just fine. 90 seconds later, the siren started. The police arrived to a sidewalk full of people who had all, individually and simultaneously, been struck by a form of collective amnesia. Nobody had seen anything. Not the old women who had been standing 10 feet from the body when it happened. Not the kids who had been playing 10 feet in the other direction. Not the mailman who had been mid-route. Not the vendor who had dropped his cassettes. Not one person. 300 witnesses. 0 descriptions. This was not fear, or not only fear. This was Harlem expressing a verdict. This was a community that had spent decades watching the wrong. People get protected, and the wrong people get punished, making a collective decision about who Frank Lucas was and what the appropriate response to that reality looked like. The police drove away with nothing, and the story started moving dot By the time the sun went down on September 12, 1968, the story of what had happened on 116th Street was already in motion. Through the underground networks of New York City, the bars and pool halls and back offices and car interiors where information traveled between the people who needed it. By morning, every serious operator from the South Bronx to Flatbush knew the shape of it. Frank Lucas had walked up to a 270-pound Harlem gangster in broad daylight on a busy Thursday afternoon, had shot him 4 times in front of 300 people, had stood over the body and counted the money, had left $3,000 for the funeral expenses, had walked back across the street and finished his lunch, had not run, had not hidden, had not shown a moment's hesitation or fear or regret. 300 witnesses. Not one word to the police. The Italian families, whose assessment of any situation was calibrated by decades of experience managing exactly this kind of power transition, called a meeting. The 5 families had been watching Harlem since Bumpy Johnson died, trying to determine what the new structure would look like and how they would need to adjust their own arrangements accordingly. Carlo Gambino, whose operational judgment had kept the Gambino family at the top of New York's organized crime hierarchy for years, offered an assessment that was passed around the table and that nobody disputed. A man who kills in front of 300 people isn't afraid of anything. We don't do business with crazy. We do business with professionals. That man is both. Within 3 months of September 12, 1968, the architecture of Frank Lucas's operation had changed beyond recognition. Dealers who had been sitting on the fence about blue magic suddenly wanted in. The hesitation that comes from uncertainty about who is actually in charge, the organizational paralysis that follows any major power transition, evaporated. Frank Lucas was in charge. Everyone now understood this in the clearest possible terms, because Frank Lucas had made them understand it in the clearest possible terms. His brothers ran territories across Harlem, the Bronx, Brooklyn. The distribution network that had been generating 50,000 a week was now generating 200,000, then 500,000, then climbing toward the number that would define the peak of the operation, $1 million a day. The empire that Frank Lucas built between 1968 and 1975, the empire that would eventually process over $400 million, and that would be partially funded by heroin smuggled inside the sealed coffins of American soldiers returning from Vietnam. A logistics operation so audacious and so carefully executed that law enforcement refused to believe it was real until they had no choice. Had its real foundation poured on a sidewalk on 116th Street on a hot Thursday afternoon. But the number and the logistics and the territory missed something essential about what happened that day. What happened on September 12, 1968, was not primarily an act of violence. Violence in that world was common. Men were shot every day. What was not common, what was, in fact, almost without precedent, was the specific choreography of what Frank Lucas did and how he did it. He did not shoot Tango in an alley. He did not send someone else to do it. He did not do it in the dark or behind closed doors or in any of the ways that violence in that world was usually managed, quietly, deniably, at a remove. He did it in the middle of the afternoon on one of the most trafficked blocks in Harlem with 300 people watching. And then he stayed. He counted the money over the body. He left a portion of it behind as a message that had a specific meaning. I know exactly what I just did. I am not afraid of what it means, and I have already thought further ahead than you have. He walked back across the street, and he sat down, and he ate his lunch. This was not impulsiveness. This was not rage. This was, as Frank Lucas himself would explain it years later from a prison interview room calculation. 3 weeks of surveillance. 3 weeks of watching Tango walk the same route at the same time to the same bodega for the same sandwich. 3 weeks of building a complete picture of a man's predictability. 3 weeks of deciding exactly what needed to happen, exactly where it needed to happen, exactly when, and exactly what the aftermath needed to look like. When the interviewer asked Frank, years after the arrest and the trial and the cooperation agreement and the reduced sentence and all of it, whether he had been scared that day, Frank smiled. It was a specific smile, cold in a way that was not hostile, certain in a way that was not arrogant, the smile of a man who has arrived at a position through a process that he trusts completely. Scared of what? Tango was already dead the moment he disrespected me at Bumpy's funeral. It just took him a few weeks to realize it. That's the difference. Gangsters react. Legends calculate. Frank Lucas had been calculating for 3 weeks, while Tango had been celebrating. Had been moving through his daily routine, on the same route, at the same time getting the same sandwich. Absolutely certain that he was untouchable. Absolutely certain that the driver boy was not a serious problem. Absolutely certain that the new landscape of Harlem would sort itself out in his favor the way the old landscape always had. He was wrong on every count, and the price of that wrongness was paid on 116th Street at 12 minutes past noon on the 12th of September, 1968. Harlem in that year was a specific kind of brutal. The Italian families were pushing hard on territory. Corrupt police officers were not just looking the other way from the drug trade. They were participating in it, confiscating product and reselling it, running protection for the dealers who paid them and setting up the ones who didn't. Poverty so deep and so structural that it had become, for whole generations, simply the weather, the permanent condition in which every decision was made. Every calculation was run, every possible future was imagined, and most of them were discarded because the resources did not exist to get there. Into this landscape, Frank Lucas had brought something that nobody else had, a product that was genuinely superior to anything else available, a logistic structure that nobody else could replicate, and a strategic mind that had been trained by one of the most effective power brokers in Harlem history. What he added on September 12th was something that no product quality and no logistics, structure, and no strategic sophistication could substitute for. The kind of absolute clarity about who held power that only comes from a public demonstration that cannot be misread or explained away. The shooting on 116th Street was not a message sent in code. It was not a message that required interpretation or context or insider knowledge to understand. It was a message in the plainest possible language, delivered to the largest possible audience, in the most public possible setting. Frank Lucas was the king of Harlem. He had just explained this to 300 people simultaneously, and those 300 people had responded by telling the police they had not seen anything, which was the clearest possible confirmation that the message had been received. The gun was not the power. The gun was the announcement that the power had already been established, calculated, and was now being claimed. And when Frank Lucas sat back down at his table inside Sylvia's cafe and picked up his fried chicken and Miss Dorothy stood at the kitchen door with her hand over her mouth, and his brothers sat across from him with their expressions of stunned incomprehension. Frank Lucas was doing something that looked like finishing lunch. But what he was actually doing was exactly what Bumpy Johnson had taught him to do with every decision, every move, every moment that the world was watching. He was being understood to understand the full weight of what Frank Lucas accomplished in the years that followed. You have to understand the world he was operating in, not the romanticized version, not the Hollywood version. Not the version that gets cleaned up for consumption by audiences who want the excitement without the smell of what it actually was. The Harlem of 1968 was a borough inside a city that had been making a specific set of decisions about its black neighborhoods for decades. Decisions about housing, about schools, about employment, about where money flowed and where it did not. And those decisions had produced a landscape of concentrated poverty and concentrated ambition that existed in permanent tension with each other. Young men in that landscape were making calculations constantly about what was available to them and what was not. And the narcotics trade was not an aberration from that reality. It was a rational response to it. Frank Lucas had grown up in Roanoke, North Carolina, in conditions that make the word poverty sound almost polite. He had come to New York as a teenager with nothing except the particular intelligence that difficulty, if you survive it and pay attention to it, sometimes produces. He had found Bumpy Johnson. And Bumpy Johnson, who had done his own versions of the same calculations in an earlier era of the same landscape, had recognized something in Frank that was worth cultivating. What Bumpy taught Frank was not primarily about drugs or territory or violence, though all of those things were part of it. What Bumpy taught Frank was about reading people, about understanding what a person actually wants versus what they say they want, about identifying the difference between a man who is performing power and a man who actually has it, about patience, the specific discipline of not acting until the action will be perfectly effective, of letting time do work that impulsiveness would ruin, and about what Bumpy called, in his direct way, being understood. Not liked, not feared exactly, though was part of it, understood. When people understand who you are and what you will do. Bumpy told Frank, you do not have to do it very often. The understanding is the power. The demonstration is just the proof. Frank Lucas had internalized this so completely that by the time he crossed 116th Street on September 12, 1968, he was not acting out of anger or frustration or any of the reactive emotions that got most men in his world killed or imprisoned before they could build anything lasting. He was executing a decision he had made 6 weeks earlier at a funeral in the 3 seconds he spent looking at Tango after the man called across the room for a light. In those 3 seconds, Frank had understood that Tango was not going to respect him. Not because Tango was evil, exactly, but because Tango had a specific model of the world in which Frank Lucas was the driver and Tango was the operator. And that model had been confirmed by so many experiences over so many years that Tango had lost the capacity to see it being wrong. The only language that could reach that model was the one Frank used on September 12th. This is what the Hollywood version misses. The Denzel Washington film, which is a good film, by the standards of what it is, presents Frank Lucas as a man of instinct and charisma, a force of nature who rises by being more willing than anyone else to do what needs to be done. And there is truth in that. But the deeper truth, the truth that explains why Frank Lucas built an empire that lasted 7 years and generated the kind of money that the Harlem narcotics trade had never seen before, is not about willingness. It is about patience and intelligence and the specific discipline of a man who has been taught by one of the best teachers available in that world how to see a situation completely before he moves. 3 weeks of surveillance from inside a parked Lincoln in a janitor's uniform. 3 weeks of watching Tango walk the same route to the same bodega for the same sandwich. That is not the behavior of a man acting on instinct. That is the behavior of a man who intends to be completely right because he understands that in this world, you only get one chance to make the thing you need to make, and it has to be made correctly the first time. The aftermath of September 12th confirmed everything Frank had understood. The Italian family's assessment, delivered through Carlo Gambino's words, was not just a compliment. It was a statement of policy. The 5 families had been watching Harlem's transition with considerable interest, trying to determine whether the new structure would be more or less manageable than the Bumpy Johnson era. What they saw on 116th Street told them something specific. This was not a power vacuum. This was a power transfer, and it had been completed. And the man who now held power in Harlem was the kind of professional whose approach to business would be predictable, organized, and oriented toward results rather than theater. The irony that Tango had died from being predictable, while Frank rose by being completely unpredictable, in terms of the specific form his declaration of power would take, even if the declaration itself was inevitable, was not lost on the people who thought carefully about these things. Frank Lucas was, by any honest assessment, a criminal who profited enormously from human suffering and whose product destroyed an incalculable number of lives in the neighborhoods he claimed to care about. This is the part that does not fit neatly into the legend, and the part that the legend tends to quietly misplace. The blue magic that Frank Lucas was so proud of, so pure, so sought after, so far superior to the cut product that everyone else was selling, was also, by virtue of its purity, more addictive and more dangerous than the alternatives. The neighborhoods through which it moved were already struggling with poverty and structural abandonment. Frank's operation made that worse in ways that compound over generations and do not appear in the revenue figures. He knew this. He said things at various points in his life that suggested he thought about it. Whether he made peace with it or not, whether he genuinely believed that the money he occasionally put back into the community balanced the damage, is not something anyone can know with certainty from the outside. What is certain is that the story of Frank Lucas is not a simple story. It is not the story of a hero. It is not the story of a villain. It is the story of a man of extraordinary intelligence and discipline and patience, who was produced by a set of conditions that he did not choose, who was taught by a mentor of genuine genius and genuine ruthlessness, who made a series of decisions that were logical within the framework of the world he inhabited and catastrophic from the perspective of the world those decisions affected. And it is the story of a single afternoon in September 1968, when all of that, the intelligence, the patience, the training, the calculation, the understanding of how power actually works, came together on a sidewalk on 116th Street in front of 300 people. Frank Lucas crossed that street with 4 shots to fire and a kingdom to claim and a lesson to deliver that 300 witnesses and the entire New York underworld, and even the Italian families would never forget. He crossed it knowing exactly what he was going to do, exactly why, and exactly what it would mean. He crossed it because Bumpy Johnson had spent years teaching him the difference between the men who react and the men who calculate. And Frank Lucas had decided 6 weeks earlier at a funeral which kind of man he was going to be. He crossed it because predictable men don't last, and because 3 seconds of silence can be a death sentence, and because the king does not send a message through intermediaries. He crossed it because respect in Harlem in 1968 was not a social nicety. It was a survival requirement, a business foundation, the single most important infrastructure of an operation that intended to last. And he crossed it because Tango had set a drink on a piano, without a coaster, and called across a funeral, room for a light, and had spent 6 subsequent weeks being exactly the kind of man who does not survive the next thing that happens. 4 shots, broad daylight, 300 witnesses, 0 descriptions, fried chicken finished. Harlem understood. Frank Lucas had arrived, and the streets would not be the same again. The weeks that followed September 12th were a study in what happens to a landscape after the central question of power is definitively answered. In the days immediately following the shooting, there was the expected period of surface stillness, the kind that follows any significant act of public violence, when the people who need to assess the situation are doing their assessing quietly. Frank did not rush this period. He understood, from everything Bumpy had taught him, and from his own careful observation of how power transitions work, that the days immediately following a declaration are in some ways more important than the declaration itself. The shooting had established a fact. What Frank did with the days that followed was establish a pattern, a way of operating that told everyone watching that the September 12th shooting was not an eruption, not an exception, not a moment of exceptional pressure producing an exceptional response, but rather a single visible expression of a consistent underlying reality. Frank was methodical. He met with his brothers individually and as a group, clarifying roles and territories and expectations. He had a discipline about these meetings that was unusual in that world. He was on time. He was prepared. He was direct about what he needed and clear about what he would and would not accept. He managed the blue magic supply chain with the kind of attention to detail that most operators in the Harlem trade applied only to their personal spending. He built in redundancies. He created protocols. He did not rely on any single person, any single supply line, any single distribution channel. Bumpy Johnson had taught him that the only operation that lasts is the one that can survive any single point of failure, that the test of a real business is not whether everything works when everything works, but whether it continues to function when something breaks. Frank was building something that he intended to last. He was also, throughout this period, invisible in the way that he had always been invisible, not in the sense of being unknown, but in the sense of not performing as power for audiences that did not need to see it. This was one of the things that distinguished Frank Lucas most sharply from the men around him, including the men who worked for him, in a world where visibility was currency, where what you wore and what you drove and what kind of table you sat at in what kind of restaurant communicated your status as surely as any balance sheet. Frank Lucas wore ordinary clothes, drove ordinary cars much of the time, avoided the kind of conspicuous display that attracted exactly the wrong kind of attention. This discipline did not come naturally to him. It was learned. Bumpy Johnson had understood, from painful experience, that the men who built the most durable organizations in that world were not always the ones with the biggest profiles. Profiles attract scrutiny. Scrutiny creates problems. The men who lasted were often the ones who could be powerful and quiet at the same time, who could let others occupy the visible positions, while they occupied the ones that actually mattered. Frank internalized this. He was not invisible in the way that a ghost is invisible. He was not trying to disappear. He was invisible in the way that a foundation is invisible, essential, structural, present everywhere in the thing it supports, and visible only when you understand what you are looking at. By the end of 1968, Frank Lucas's operation was generating revenue that exceeded anything Harlem had produced before. By the middle of 1969, his brothers were running territories that collectively covered most of the high-volume distribution geography in the Northeastern Corridor. By 1970, Frank Lucas was a millionaire many times over. Money that moved through real estate and restaurants and dry cleaning, operations and any number of other legitimate fronts that Bumpy had taught him were essential not just for laundering, but for building the kind of stable asset base that could survive the inevitable disruptions that hit any operation operating outside the law. He was also, by this point, beginning to build the infrastructure of the Vietnam supply chain, the audacious, nearly impossible logistics operation that would eventually allow him to move product from Southeast Asia to the streets of New York, inside the sealed coffins of American soldiers, returning from a war that was consuming the generation of men who would otherwise have been the natural pool of foot soldiers for operations, like Frank's. The coffin operation was the most extraordinary piece of logistical thinking in the history of the American drug trade. It was also the clearest expression of what Frank Lucas was at his core, not a man who reacted to the world as he found it, but a man who looked at every constraint and every barrier and everything that other people accepted as a fixed condition and asked whether it actually had to be that way. The Italian families controlled the ports. The D controlled the import inspection infrastructure. The existing supply chains for narcotics coming into New York were all controlled by people who would never sell to a black operator at the source price, who would always extract a toll from every level of the distribution chain. Frank Lucas looked at this system and decided to go around it entirely. He went to Southeast Asia. He built relationships at the source. He figured out a logistics chain that bypassed every single choke point that his competitors were paying tribute to navigate. And then he used the most sacred, most protected, most politically untouchable transportation infrastructure available, the military's return of its dead from an unpopular war, to move his product. It was brilliant in the way that the genuinely dangerous ideas are brilliant, completely obvious in retrospect, completely invisible to everyone who was looking at the problem until Frank Lucas showed them what they had been unable to see. None of this would have been possible without September 12, 1968, not because the shooting created the supply chain. Frank's relationship with the Southeast Asian source predated the shooting, or was developed concurrently, but because the shooting created the authority that made everything else possible. The distribution network, the brother network, the territory structure, the relationships with the Italian, families that eventually moved from cautious respect to functional working arrangement. All of it depended on the clarity that Frank, established on a sidewalk on 116th Street in front of 300 people, who saw everything and told the police they had seen nothing. Power in that world was not just about having the best product or the best logistics or the best organizational structure. It was about whether the people you needed to cooperate with you believed that you were the kind of person who would actually do what needed to be done. Tango had not believed that. 300 people on a Harlem sidewalk subsequently learned the cost of that belief. And every operator in New York City, from the corner dealers to the 5 Italian families, adjusted their model of reality accordingly. Frank Lucas was a man who would actually do what needed to be done. This meant that most of the things that needed to be done did not, in fact, need to be done, because the people who would otherwise have required doing things to understood, without requiring a demonstration, that the doing was available as an option. This is what Bumpy meant by being understood. You do not have to shoot every man who disrespects you if every man knows that you shot the last one and did not run and did not hide and sat back down and finished your lunch. The understanding does the work. The shooting was not the point. The understanding was the point. The shooting was just the proof. Frank Lucas ran his operation from 1968 to 1975. 7 years that transformed the economics of the Harlem drug trade and produced a level of organizational sophistication that the DIA, when they finally began to properly understand what they were looking at, found almost incomprehensible. They had been looking for an operation organized the way Italian organized crime was organized, hierarchical, formal, with recognizable structures and titles and protocols. What Frank had built was different. It was family-based, flexible, decentralized in some ways, and tightly controlled in others. And it was built around a single product, Blue Magic, whose quality and consistency created a kind of brand loyalty that operated almost like a legitimate business's relationship with its customers. When the D finally moved on Frank in 1975, they moved with the conviction of men who believed they were taking down the biggest narcotics operation in New York City history. They were right about that. What they did not initially understand was that Frank Lucas, in the years following his arrest, would become something that no major drug lord had been before. A cooperating witness whose information was so extensive and so accurate that it produced convictions against more than 100 officers of the New York Police Department and the Drug Enforcement Administration. The corruption that Frank Lucas exposed, the specific documented transactional corruption of law enforcement officers who had been taking money from this operation and from other operations for years, was in some ways a more significant legacy than the empire itself. It revealed in concrete and prosecutable terms what everyone in Harlem had known in general terms for decades, that the system was not broken. It was working exactly as designed. The design was just not the one that was advertised. Frank Lucas died in 2019. He was 88 years old. He had spent decades after his release from prison operating at the margins of celebrity, the subject of a major Hollywood film, the source for documentaries and interviews and profiles, a man whose story had become a kind of mirror in which Americans could see, if they chose to look, something about the specific ways that their country had organized itself and the specific people that organization had produced. He talked about his life with a directness that was unusual and that most people who spoke to him noted immediately. He did not minimize what he had done, but he also did not perform remorse for audiences who wanted it. He had done what he had done because the world he lived in had presented him with the choices it had presented him with, and he had made the ones that made sense within the logic of that world. Whether the logic of that world was itself correct was a different question, and one that Frank Lucas seemed to have understood in his quiet way more fully than many of the people who told his story. The 4 shots on 116th Street were one afternoon in a life that lasted 8 decades and contained multitudes. They were not the whole story, but they were the moment when the story became inevitable, the moment when Frank Lucas stopped being Bumpy Johnson's driver and became, in the truest sense that the word can be used in this context, himself. He crossed the street. He leveled the gun. He did what needed to be done. And then he went back to his table and finished his lunch. In Harlem, in 1968, on September 12th, that was how a king arrived. Not with speeches or ceremony, not with a procession or a formal transfer of authority. With 4 shots in broad daylight, a handful of bills laid across a dead man's chest, and the kind of absolute calm that only comes from 3 weeks of calculation and a lifetime of being taught by the best available teacher exactly how this works. 300 witnesses. 0 descriptions. The king had arrived, and Harlem understood.